Thank you, everybody. We're going to get started. I'm Dan Runde. I hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And we're not here at CSIS today. We're at the Senate building, but this is a CSIS event, and Senator Lugar's team has been so generous to help us secure this very special room. It's a real privilege to have this use of the space. It's a personal and professional privilege to introduce Senator Richard Lugar. In every generation, there's a leader who helps shape America's role in the world, and Senator Lugar has been that person for our generation. I can think of legislation like Lugar, his leadership on trade, his leadership on assistance, standing for a strong U.S. military. He's a Republican internationalist who's worked across the aisle and has gotten many, many things done. And the world is a better place, and America is a better place for Senator Lugar's leadership. And it's really wonderful that he would be with us today to help us launch this report that you have in your hands, which is about the future relationship the United States is going to have with a number of countries in the world. These are middle-income countries, and you'll hear from Senator Lugar about this, about middle-income countries. And so I think it's totally appropriate that Senator Lugar is here to help us get this started. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the podium over to Senator Lugar. I would ask you not just to applaud Senator Lugar, but I hope you'll recognize Senator Lugar.
I want to thank Dan Runde, my dear friend, for inviting me to be with you this morning with this distinguished panel. As he has mentioned, we are in one of the historic rooms of the Russell Building, the first Senate office building. This room has housed some remarkable hearings of our government, including all of the Watergate hearings and various other controversial situations. Mercifully, today's situation is a much more constructive event. Last evening, as a matter of fact, in this very room, the Historical Society of the Capitol commemorated the 50th anniversary of the Historical Society and recognized the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And it was a beautiful program of the history of the committee dating back 196 years, as I recall, with lists of all of the chairmen, various events which had occurred. So it's a special privilege to be in this room with you today. And this I simply want to say at the outset is an applause for CSIS, for the team that brought about the scholarship that has gone into this new report that you are reading and are going to hear about today on foreign assistance transitions. I'm certain that today's panel will amplify this important examination of how our relationship with middle-income countries can be enriched, even if we rely less on traditional development assistance. Our discussion today takes place against an unfortunate backdrop of anemic economic growth in the United States, a United States unemployment rate of more than 8%. Our national debt is approaching $16 trillion, and efforts to contain and reverse our budget spiral are complicated by financial pressures from an aging population, lengthy military engagements, and sometimes partisan gridlock. Many other countries, including some who have been important partners in global development, face even more severe economic scenarios. Amid these financial threats, it's inevitable that some would question the role of the United States in global development. A few members of Congress, in fact, argue that all foreign assistance should be eliminated. A larger number would preserve assistance to Israel and some other politically popular economies and elements, but would sharply downsize development aid, and almost everybody expects that the United States assistance funding will be constrained for the foreseeable future. Now, despite these pressures, I believe we should not hesitate to make the national security and the moral case for development assistance. When properly administered, development assistance remains a bargain for the United States national security and for our own economic and moral standing in the world. Foreign assistance is a key component of the United States national security strategy, especially since the tragic events of September 11, 2001. It is evident that poorly governed states with impoverished populations can prove to be grave threats to our national security. Nations that struggle with severe poverty and corrupt governance are at greater risk from terrorism and instability. We have spent hundreds of billions of dollars in recent years fighting wars and preparing for military scenarios for underdeveloped regions in the world. If properly targeted, foreign assistance programs can mitigate national security risks and improve U.S. connections to peoples and their governments. They may well save huge military expenditures down the road. And this is one of the reasons why the Defense Department has been a strong advocate of a robust foreign affairs budget. Beyond the national security imperative, no nation that claims to possess the moral high ground can afford to relinquish its leadership in addressing global disease, hunger, and ignorance. We diminish ourselves and our national reputation if we turn our backs on the obvious plight of hundreds of millions of people who are living on less than $1 a day and facing severe risk from hunger and disease every day. But even as those of us who advocate foreign assistance make these arguments, we must be working hard to ensure efficiency in United States assistance programs. Among other management imperatives, we should be striving for a very high standard of transparency, and we should be directing development dollars to projects that will produce the most demonstrable results for impoverished peoples. We also should take stock of our assistance to countries whose economic prospects have improved significantly. There are many such successes in the stories of the developing world, and our assistance relationships with some of these countries needs to evolve in response to the positive changes that are occurring. Our discussion today, undergirded by the new CSIS report, Strategic Foreign Assistance Transitions, will examine how the United States can use innovative forms of engagement that deliver more economic and strategic benefits at less cost to taxpayers. The United States and other wealthy countries should be seizing opportunities to advance trade and investment relationships in the developing world that complement and solidify progress that has been achieved through foreign assistance over a number of years. Brazil, India, China, and other middle-income countries have lifted hundreds of millions of their citizens out of poverty. According to the IMF, 45% of global output will come from Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Russia, and South Korea by the year 2025. Nevertheless, we continue to fund development programs in middle-income countries. Development aid to such countries is not necessarily harmful and may be fully warranted in some cases to achieve specific national security or economic objectives. But we should continually ask whether other forms of engagement are more appropriate and more effective to achieve our strategic objectives. Most successful middle-income countries want deeper bilateral trade relationships, and more extensive collaboration on science and technology, including more formal linkages between universities. They also have a strong desire to cooperate with us on professionalizing their nonprofit and philanthropic sectors, and a desire for a thriving free market system that encourages entrepreneurship. In many cases, they're also interested in working with us on development projects in third countries. The United States has often supported such progress and sought deeper trade and cooperation with middle-income countries. The United States government can turn to a number of instruments that are well-trained and well-suited to carry through these assistance transitions. We have the United States Trade and Development Administration, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and the Export-Import Bank, all of which can carry out non-traditional forms of development cooperation with middle-income countries. Even a traditional development agency like USAID possesses innovative instruments, such as the Development Credit Authority, which catalyzes private enterprise with very minimal cost to United States taxpayers. The concept of transitioning from development assistance is not new. For example, the United States assistance helped support Portugal when it was facing political instability in the 1970s. Now Portugal is a steadfast ally and a well-integrated member of the global community. Similarly, South Korea is one of our most reliable partners in supporting a free and prosperous world. Extensive United States assistance over the years, combined with prudent economic planning, played a powerful role in helping advance South Korea on its current status. More recently, we've supported partners like Lithuania, helping that country grow prosperous after the fall of communism. Lithuania received USAID funding until the year 2000 and is now a member of both the European Union and NATO. Countries that undergo successful transitions often emerge to become our best allies and trading partners. And as we pursue these transitions, we should be careful not to disregard the strategic investments that we have made in the past. In Brazil, India, and other countries, we've invested billions of dollars over the years and committed a tremendous amount of human resources as well. It is critical that we preserve and build upon the legacy of United States assistance. For example, Brazil's Agricultural Research Agency was partially funded by U.S. assistance. It is now a major strategic asset for Brazil and a key reason for that country's unique perspective and capabilities related to global food security. Similarly, USAID played a central role in bringing the Green Revolution to India, turning a famine-affected country into an agricultural exporter. Now India is a G20 member with its own space and foreign assistance programs. The American people have helped many countries prosper in the past. We should think now strategically and embrace innovative mechanisms to reshape our engagement with countries that are ready to transition from development assistance. We have an impressive panel here today to discuss opportunities for development transitions and how we can implement them. And I appreciate the thoughtfulness that the panel brings to these topics. I wish each of you in this great assembly success as you contribute in your own ways to global development, United States foreign policy in the future. I thank you very much for the honor of addressing you.
Thank you very much, Senator Lugar, for being with us. We so appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. Thank you. so appreciative of everyone taking time out of their schedules to be with us here today, especially my friends and colleagues on the panel, as well as many notable folks who are in the audience. My friend Juan Jose Dabub is here, who's the former managing director of the World Bank. I believe that there are several other friends here that I see in the audience. I'm so grateful that you've all taken time out of your busy schedules to be here. I want to recognize a couple of folks before we start, and then I won't speak too long. I want to first recognize the Smith Richardson Foundation and Nadia Shadlow for helping fund the work that we did on this report. I do hope you have a chance to look at the report and think about its findings. But I also need to particularly thank Amasya Zargarian, who's in the back of the room, who's really helped make this report happen. I'm very particularly grateful to you, Amasya. Thank you very, very much for all of your hard work. And then the project advisor, Joanna Mendelson-Foreman, and Ilona Teleki, who really helped make this happen. So I'm very, very grateful. I think that I'll make a couple framing remarks, and then I'm going to hand the discussion over to my colleagues. The world has changed, and there are a number of opportunities for the United States to pivot to a new kind of a relationship with a number of middle-income countries. And in some ways, we've been fighting the last war in development with a number of middle-income countries. We talked to over 200 people, and we visited Brazil, Russia, India, and Panama as part of the work. We interviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of people. And no one said to us, what we really need from the United States is a same old, if you'll allow me to say, chicken or beef traditional foreign assistance model for our middle-income country. What we really want is for you to plus up your traditional foreign assistance to us. No one said that. What they said is we want more trade, we want a deeper relationship with you on science and technology, we want a deeper relationship with you on how to professionalize our nonprofit and our philanthropic sectors, something the United States is uniquely qualified to do. We want help with making it easier for entrepreneurs to flourish, just like in the United States. What we want is greater engagement with higher education. We want better people-to-people context. Those were the constants throughout. And by the way, to the extent that we have a foreign assistance program, we'd like to partner with you in third countries and leverage our assets and resources and have a different kind of a relationship. We don't want a donor-recipient relationship. But oftentimes, for a number of different structural reasons, either because of sometimes congressional earmarking, sometimes specific concerns about what will happen to the geostrategic relationship in the executive branch, there's been a reluctance to change the way in which we have our assistance relationship hasn't shifted the way it ought to. And the Obama administration, to its great credit, has recognized that we need to change. Rasham gave a very important speech in January of 2011 where he talked about shifting and working ourselves out of business. The president's presidential directive on global development in the fall of 2010 also talks about picking our spots. And so this makes total sense, and it's very much in line with the administration's thinking. And so I think this is a bipartisan opportunity, as you can see from Senator Lugar's remarks. And I think we'll have a chance now to hear from the panelists, their perspectives on the opportunities and some of the challenges to operationalize this. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn the panel over. I'm going to first ask my friend Rich Bissell. Each of you has the biographies and the organizations, affiliations, which each of the speakers is affiliated with. But so I won't go into long detail about each one. So I'm going to hand the floor over now to my friend Rich Bissell from the National Academy of Science. Rich.
Thank you very much, Dan. I appreciate your letting me have a spot on the panel today to talk about a couple key questions you posed to me, and I'm glad you gave me an hour and a half to talk about them. Seriously, this is a wonderful report. It's wonderful because it forces us to think outside the box. It really invites us to put aside some of our traditional responses and think more broadly about what the options are in a time of transition and challenge for the United States and for our aid recipients around the world. Let me start with context. The context of this report really, if you think about it, has to do with the age-old problem of how do you deal with success. And we're in a world where so many countries are moving from what we might call the fourth world into the second and third world. Is a credit, I think, to assistance programs and to broader economic development around the world, which in the last few decades has been quite extraordinary. But how we respond to that question of what we do in response to success, which tends to fall into two camps. Do you simply cut off assistance, or do you transform it into a different relationship? And obviously my bias will come out that I lean towards the second. Really depends upon our understanding of what the available tools are, what an assistance or partnership program can be. And that's where the report and putting ideas on the table and stimulating the discussion, I think, makes a real contribution. I'd cite just quickly two very, one you might consider old historical models for how you respond to this. In part because the United States has been tested in this question repeatedly over the last century. After World War I, some of you may recall that Herbert Hoover made his reputation as one of the great leaders of the age, in fact, by organizing the relief operation in Europe after World War I. And Congress actually passed an act called the American Relief Administration, gave him $100 million and said, we want that matched with $100 million of private contributions and go do good. And between 1919 and 1923, he fed upwards of 20 to 30 million people a day in single countries like Russia. He covered pretty much all of Europe and became known as the great engineer of relief operations. In 1923, in the last country he was operating in, which was Russia, he discovered that they were exporting wheat, and so he shut down the program, period. It closed down, everybody went home, never looked back. 1920s turned into be an economic nightmare for most of Europe. Contrasting case would be the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was created, as you know, on the basis of a speech by Secretary of State George Marshall, signed off by Harry Truman with a very large appropriation to create the Economic Cooperation Administration, providing more than $13 billion to Western European countries that were in the tank economically after World War II. It wasn't a relief operation, it was more of a pump priming operation where capital was put in, but it was clearly intended to be a short-term measure. And from a political perspective in the US, it was made even more short-term by the emergence of the Korean War, which placed huge financial demands on the US. And there were calls to immediately shut down the Marshall Plan. Interestingly, that isn't what happened. They did shut down the financial side of the Marshall Plan, but they took a small institution that had been created in the Marshall Plan called the OEEC, the Office of European Economic Cooperation, and evolved it into the OECD, which became an institutional instrument for collaboration between the United States and Western Europe that pervaded all areas of economic life to the present day. A very different kind of transition, a different response, even though on the books, financially, it will look very similar. But that was also a great success story. If you look at the change of growth rates and trade and economic production and so forth in Europe during those 5 years of the Marshall Plan, it was quite stunning. So today, when you look at the question of transition for success stories, you get lots of different answers. And you get them based in large part upon what your individual understanding is of what can be done. What is it that an assistance program does? What can partnership programs look like? And given all the zigs and zags in our foreign assistance programs over the last 30 years, people's understanding is very selective. And you may come from the 1970s, the basic human needs period, or you may come from the integrated programs of the 60s, or you may come from other eras since then, where in fact our foreign assistance was focused in one way or another. We've shown that we can give leadership to short-term relief and rehabilitation, as in Haiti after the 2009 earthquake. But on the other hand, we commit billions annually for the indefinite future for the campaign against HIV/AIDS. So we actually have a multi-aspect, and you can pick and choose your model as you want. The helpful thing about this report from Dan and his colleagues at CSIS is it really challenges to make sense of that strategic context. So that's the first thing I just want to say thank you to them for. The second on the content is I want to take just a couple of minutes to focus on a few of the recommendations. I think it's very exciting that the report focuses on science and technology and long-term partnerships. Developing countries that are succeeding really look forward to working with the US on science and technology. If you look at public opinion polls, and I have the latest from the Pew Center, that show among all the different attributes by foreign publics and elites looking at the United States, the accomplishments and the advances and potential for collaboration with US and S&T scores the highest of anything, way above any other element, even including Hollywood movies. So, and it's been improving in recent years. I could take any number and look at the longitudinal polls between 2002, 2007, 2012, and the numbers are all going up, even in countries like Pakistan, up 12 points over the last, in fact, over the last 5 years. Turkey up 5, China up, Japan is up. So it's an area that seems to be as an area of natural advantage for us as we think about where we want to build for the future. I think the current administration has recognized this. If you look at the way they've reinvigorated science and technology at USAID as a way of developing a whole series of experiments of how you build those partnerships, both involving partnerships with US-based institutions and also the countries where they want to provide assistance and partnerships. So this is, I think, created an important foundation that could sustain the vision that's laid out in the CSIS report. I want to refer to just one recommendation and make a constructive suggestion about it, which is the recommendation on page 82 where it suggests creating an office in USAID for middle-income country transitions. And I'm glad that it focuses, at least to some extent, on our need internally to make that changes as well as inside developing countries and partner countries. On my experience, based on working in science and technology and AID, I think we should actually consider creating an entity associated with AID but functioning more as a foundation. If you think back to the late 1940s when President Truman was faced with the recommendation to create an entity for science and technology in the US government, one recommendation was to create a ministry of a department of science. And he chose not to. What he created instead was the National Science Foundation, because it created a long-term purpose. It created the opportunity to have sustained financial support and provide support to a sector of the economy and our society that can't live year to year in the way that most appropriations operate in this country. And I think that question should be raised here, is if we in fact want USAID and the rest of our assistance framework to be able to develop appropriate partnerships through contracts and grants for the long term. I'd also like the report to have recognized one major source of partnerships that was not given much attention, and that's the scale of remittances today. If you look at this, it is quite stunning for a person like myself who's followed this over a couple decades to see the scale. According to World Bank estimates, remittances in 2009, those are the latest numbers I have, were over $400 billion annually. Take individual countries. India, 55 billion. Morocco, 6 billion. Philippines, 21 billion. They dwarf any kind of assistance that we can provide from the government at such a scale that one has to think about how one can help to facilitate that and to channel it into the kinds of social, economic gains that all of our programs are designed to achieve in working with our partners abroad. So I would just say lastly that timing is everything. We know that in Washington. What worked in 1961 probably won't work in 2012 or 2013. Today we're awash in networking and crowdsourcing and partnerships that happen at the individual level as well as institutional. We need to be able, in thinking about these options, to take advantage of where the dynamic is going, where the underlying trends that in fact our small amount of assistance can catalyze, can move to a next level and focus. In that case, I think we're more likely to be successful. So again, a terrific report. I think it starts an important debate, and I hope the debate can begin. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks very much. Rodney, you currently have an office at the UN, but it doesn't really demonstrate what your past lives have been. If people read your biography, they'll see that you've had several very distinguished past lives in the federal government system, and that's why I asked to be on this panel. So, Rodney, please.
Thank you. I was going to say that, yes, I keep moving because people will discover what I'm good at. I think, let me make a couple of marks. I don't personally remember Herbert Hoover, but, I do think that Rich laid out the history quite accurately because I think, what's the great quote? Those who don't remember history are condemned to repeat it. A couple of things. One, we've had just in foreign assistance over the last 12 years, huge growth, enormous growth. Some of it's Afghanistan, some of it's Iraq, some of it's MCC, PEPFAR, other things. But that is really all about to change. I would say that Senator Lugar, who I think has been just a great champion, laid it on the line. That is that it's going to be constrained. We need to be very efficient about what we're going to be doing, and choices are going to be made. The report, I think, does an excellent job of laying out some of the challenges. I wanted to, I think, highlight just a couple of points. Having worked at Booz Allen, at the Treasury Department, the State Department, the Appropriations Committee, OMB, and now the UN, I think I can honestly say government is not the answer. And so I do think that partnerships are important. And frankly, I think the approach has got to be that those partnerships may not touch the government in any way, shape, or form. They may not know what university-to-university contacts are about, what businesses are doing, what the private sector is doing. And so in some measure, I think we need to get away from, well, we have to have a hand. You can have a partnership, but we need to know what it is. No, I think that, frankly, the vast bulk of economic and social and political activity will take place in a very different forum going forward. Some of the principles that I think are important for whatever remains of the U.S. Foreign Assistance Program. One is genuine partnerships, meaning like the MCC, you're working on terms of mutual respect and accommodation with countries. It's not a question of we know better. If you'll just do what we did, you'll succeed. Two, it's sustained economic growth, by which I mean it has to be something that the country owns, that they can take on, that they want to do. That may mean, in some cases, and I don't define sustained as a continued flow of U.S. government resources, means, well, where in the recipient, donor, partner, however you want to put it, country, where are the resources? If it's in healthcare, what is the Ministry of Health doing? How is it financed? What are patients or clients or whatever you want to call the participants in the system doing? It simply cannot rely on outside donors, outside contractors, outside vendors, outside NGOs. It has to be intrinsic and inherent in the country itself. Transparency is, I think, vitally important. I don't know how many of you have ever tried to find out, so what is it that the UN or AID or the MCC does? And you go and you get first the round of platitudes. We support the aspirations of people trying to do, et cetera, and then you dig down. Well, who's doing what and how are they doing it and does it work? Those are pretty trenchant questions, and in my experience, most bureaucracies are very resistant to that. They're worried that, well, they don't understand, or they don't appreciate the difficulties, or as Rich once upon a time told me, we throw the dart and then we draw the target around where the dart landed. Well, you can't do that. You really do have to have impact evaluations. You really do have to design it in. You do have to be vigilant. You do have to pare away, like Occam's razor, all of the extraneous arguments. Why? If it works, why did it work? If it didn't work, why didn't it work? And if it didn't work for reasons that you can't fix, don't do it again. Finally, I think you have to be humble about all of these things. There are so many other institutions out there that do great things that none of us will ever know about. And that doesn't mean that it's wrong or that our job is to find out what others do. It means that if it's working, great. You don't have to have a hand in it. I'll stop there, except to mention the fiscal cliff, which means huge amounts of uncertainty. And I think particularly for this community, whether you are in an agency or an outsider or part of the circle of folks who work with agencies, it's just going to be a tough time, and I would not expect any obvious answers for 3 or 6 months. On that happy note, as Debbie Downer, I'll pass it off to Peggy Philbin.
Peggy, thank you so much for being with us today. Peggy's with the Trade and Development Agency.
Thank you. Good morning. First of all, I want to thank Dan and CSIS and his team for a really thought-provoking and excellent report that we have read and taken very seriously. And we're heartened by all that he says, because what I hope to do this morning is give you a little insight, if you don't know us already, what USTDA Trade and Development Agency does. I also take Rodney's comments a little as a challenge. I don't think government's the answer, but it should and can be part of the solution. I think what Dan's report is suggesting is we all need to look and see what that solution is and where do we need to change to make it work. It's interesting that today, this year, U.S. Trade and Development is celebrating its 20th anniversary as an independent agency. We were carved out of AID, and we were given a dual mandate. That's my mother, no. And the dual mandate is really timely, given what we're talking about this morning, and it has to do with our name, trade and development. What is the merger of these two? And what we at TDA have done is tried to merge this for our mutual benefit, the mutual benefit of the United States and the host country that we work in. So we've been working on the concepts that are in Dan's report, we hope, for 20 years. Having said that, though, we think there's way more to do. We have a lot to learn, and our work over the years in the different areas of the world have led us to believe that the basic premise that you suggest, Dan, is that people don't want to hand out, certainly in the middle and emerging economies, because they are there already. What they want is to share expertise and learn from us, but also partner with us, do business with us. So if you don't know what we do, let me just boil it down in a nutshell. We largely work on critical infrastructure projects overseas. We are at the front end. We have been described by some people as sort of a mini venture capitalist firm. We're on the ground first with feasibility studies, pilot projects, training groups, to try to position U.S. companies to be in the right place to obtain procurements for mega, large, very important critical infrastructure projects around the world. And while you think some of the companies may not need this, you might be surprised to find out that around the world, sometimes it's very difficult to work up through the ministries and get things done, wherein some of the work we do opens the doors for some of the U.S. companies. Now, one of the things that Dan's report also suggests, which I think we were very struck by, is that, you know, trade is the door opener for not only business, that we do business together, but also for peace and prosperity as we go forward. The other half of that equation, and I think you touch on this, Dan, is that we also have shared challenges. Almost every place we go is dealing with the needs of a new infrastructure. They need to enhance, build, improve the infrastructure. The same problems that we face here in the United States. The other problem that they face is that their energy efficiencies are not working. We also have that same challenge. We need to get there fast and improve our energy efficient work. So what does that do? I believe that that means we have shared goals when we're on the ground in this country, and we also have shared needs. And it's a great equalizer when you can talk about the same problems with people. Let me give you a sense of what type of projects that we have been doing. Some of our most dynamic areas now, and they've greatly changed over the years. We're on the ground doing smart grid infrastructure projects. Now again, you see across the United States, lots of conversation on smart grid infrastructure. We need it here. Well, in some of the countries we deal with, they don't have the luxury of improving what they have. They have to leapfrog across and start with the new technologies. And they're very sophisticated in how they do this. We also do large projects with aviation modernization and next-gen radar. As a matter of fact, we have 3 nationwide agreements, aviation cooperation programs in Brazil and China and India because of the need to modernize and bring, in this case, a lot of the U.S. expertise on the ground to the airport business. As you know, you can't do trade if you can't land, if you can't get there. You can't deliver products unless you can deliver them. So this is a huge area, not only for safety, but for business. Rail and port development, the very same issues. Clean water projects. And clean water projects are not building wells anymore. These are very sophisticated, highly technical projects, wastewater use, energy transformation. But again, you can't do business if you don't have clean water. Cold chain storage. You know, the logistics of agriculture is the challenge today. You can have great farming, but if it stays on the farm and doesn't get to the port, nobody's making any money. So we work with some of the countries on their cold chain storage projects. Fiber optics cabling. One of the projects that we did was an early feasibility study off the coast of sub-Saharan Africa on the East Coast with CECOM on fiber optic cabling. As a result, over the years, that cable has been laid, and the dramatic usage of cell phones, the internet access, and that type of thing, and as a result, business to business has grown proportionally. We were on the ground floor in those projects, because that is what we do. We get there and we try to marry up. We are really a wonderful facilitator. Not always successful, but we think we do try to facilitate U.S. businesses with business overseas. We have two major programs that allow us to do these projects. One is our International Business Partnership Program. This is one of our newer programs, but also one of our more successful. What this largely does is set up training programs on the ground, conferences and workshops in country, and reverse trade missions. Our reverse trade missions have doubled in the last year because they've become so successful. Because what we have found is the short-term results, bringing people together before a major infrastructure project begins, is allowing U.S. businesses to demonstrate their expertise and give them, or at least level the playing field somewhat, so that they are considered. And the relationship building is critically important to this, because we send the groups out all over the United States. They visit, all the energy companies, the transportation companies, the aviation, Boeing, Honeywell, but also big and small. As a matter of fact, most of our business is done with small companies and many who have never exported before. But these efforts, in addition to opening the door for business, also, as I said, creates that partnership that we rely on and we see growing. So there's follow-on activities as a result of bringing the people together. The other program we do is our project development program, which is where we do give grants to a grantee overseas for the early part of the development of an infrastructure program, such as a feasibility study or a project or a pilot program. And these sometimes are invaluable for jump-starting a project, but also in introducing U.S. expertise on the ground at the early stage, and positions the companies to have a better chance at the ultimate procurement. Just to give you a sense of the impact, though, of these activities, a few numbers. Last year alone, for every dollar that we programmed, the United States got $58 back in exports. And we have a very robust evaluations team that actually does crunch the numbers, goes on the ground in country, and works to give us real numbers in real time. Because if we don't know what we're doing, we don't want to keep doing the same thing. The other thing is we have a 10-year evaluation cycle we look at, and I have to say, based on everyone's comments, 10 years is the world these days. I'm not sure what we did 10 years ago is necessarily relevant, but over the last 10 years, we've identified $17.5 billion in U.S. exports to emerging markets that were directly attributable to our programs, and estimate that there were 110,000 U.S. jobs created as a result. So what is our role in middle-income countries? Well, we do more than 50% of our work there, and more than 60% of the exports that come out of our projects are from middle-income countries. We have priority countries. Because we're a small agency, we have found that the more we focus, the more effective we are. So, and as a result, we do a strategic plan every year, which allows us to be a little more nimble sometimes than the bigger agencies. And having come from the bigger agencies, I know that you have a lot of clout, but it's very hard to turn the ship. Anyway, out of the 26 priority countries, 22 are middle-income countries. Now, we believe as an agency we have a few attributes that help us be more responsive to the types of issues that Dan has raised in his report. One is obviously that from our inception 20 years ago, we work with the potential for mutual economic benefit for the United States and the host country. So we're right there with you, Dan. This is a great concept, and this is where we believe also trade and investment are the way to open the doors. We have the ability to work on the local, the country, and the regional level so that we are not limited, and we can change on a yearly basis. So we have a lot of regional activities in sub-Saharan Africa. We're working with COMESA and the EAC on projects, but we also can get down to the local level if it's a valuable project that we think will make a difference. We emphasize grantee project ownership. When we give a grant overseas and we marry up the U.S. companies, once the project goes, we step out. We do not own the project. It's between the business and the grantee on the ground. We do due diligence. We have an after effect so that we come in and see how successful we were, but we step out of the actual project. So there's ownership of the project on the ground. We also have great flexibility, as I said, in our funding resources, and we review every year whether our trends and our projects are successful and make the appropriate changes. And also, we have the ability to go into middle-income countries and continue to act after other U.S. government agencies have stepped outside. So let me give you one case study, just to give you an example of what a project looks like. And this is by no means the biggest or the best, but it gives you a sense of what we're doing. We just did a feasibility study in a reverse trade mission with a refinery in Brazil, which has produced $1.5 billion in exports for the United States. It doubled their capacity for refinery, given the project that we put out. I'm shortening it because I'm going on too long, but it gives you the idea that these are the types of things we work with. And we only succeed because we also work with our U.S. government partners, you know, the Department of State, the Department of Commerce, Exim Bank, OPIC, and others. We could not do anything without all their help. So thank you very much.
Peggy, thank you so much. I think USTDA is a perfect example of a transitional instrument as we transition from an assistance paradigm to a trade paradigm, and I really appreciate you being on the panel and helping us explain that to us. Thank you very much. Patrick.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this. You know this is a subject that is very close to my heart. And so I'm thrilled by the report. And I want to start by congratulating you and CSIS for preparing such a high-quality product that makes a genuine contribution to a topic that I think is timely. So not only have you picked the right topic at the right time, but what you've actually said about it offers real grist for everybody's mills, and I think advances the conversation in a very substantive way. So congratulations for that. Now, when we talk about this and we talk about the transitions into different kinds of relationships, I think it's important that we always note and recognize that what we're talking about is evidence that the past investments we've made in development have been successful. Because we're talking about a world that is more prosperous, where countries are progressing, and where that calls for us now to re-look at what kind of relationships do we have. And it's, I like to, I think it's important for us to take credit that we've made investments, and those investments have made a real difference in the world. Now, your report emphasizes the budget environment and how that's going to drive us to make some decisions that are tough decisions, and to, I think in some ways, in many cases, overcome a kind of bureaucratic inertia that we're living with. I think it's not only the budget environment, and that may be a precipitating event, and in a sense, a fortuitous precipitating event, but I think that really what we're looking at is that there is a new global or a different global reality. The world has changed, and that change calls for us to change our approaches to how we advance our national interests, how we achieve objectives in bilateral relationships with countries and also with regions. So I want to make that point. I also want to make a point about the emphasis that the report puts on trade. And we've just heard about USTDA and what a great contribution it can make as an instrument, a transitional instrument for economic alliances. But I think that our interests go way beyond the economic alliances. And I think it's important to recognize that we've got lots of shared interests. We have political alliances, we have diplomatic alliances, there are transnational interests that we care about and that our allies care about that will drive and contribute to the kind of strong, healthy, mature relationships that I think both sides are looking for as we look at what a transition looks like. Now, in thinking about, I think what your report does is it brings us to a point where we can really start to think about, well, what do transitions look like? And what kind of instruments do we need for those transitions to be effective and to serve our national interests and to lead to strong, healthy alliances? In looking at that, I like to think of what I characterize as post-assistance development cooperation. I think in some countries, you may just have mature relationships that are based on trade, based on economic interests, based on shared political interests. I think in other countries there will continue to be very strong justification for addressing important development issues, but not necessarily through the same old instruments we've used in the past. And so I like this concept of post-assistance development cooperation. And for that to work, I think it is going to require some new institutional mechanisms. And that's why, like Rich, I like the recommendation that you make with regard to setting up a bureau in USAID that would address that. But I think it goes beyond that to look at what are the institutional mechanisms. Some exist, and you point those out, USTDA, Exim Bank, OPIC. MCC, I think, is an example of a very effective transitional instrument that our government has, not for middle-income countries, because we don't work with middle-income countries, but for the lower middle-income countries that are moving up into that category. So we have some instruments, but thinking through what do those look like and how are we going to apply them, I think is, in a sense, one of the next big challenges that this report leads us to. And finally, I just want to say one word about MCC as it's mentioned in the report. The report looks at MCC and it looks at the question of second compacts, whether there's, when we do a program with a country, when that completes, do we do a second compact? And it implies that that probably shouldn't be much of a priority, or it's not likely, I think, is how the report terms it. Not likely to see that in the future. First, at MCC, within MCC, there is a very strong attachment to the aspect of our model that we are not a rolling aid program. That just because you had aid from MCC, even if you continue to qualify, doesn't mean you're going to continue to have aid. That any MCC investment has to be earned and justified in its own right. And so that's a value that we hold very closely. And if you look at our experience, half of the compacts, of the countries that have had compacts that have closed, that continue to qualify for MCC assistance, have not received forward funding. So it's not only a value we hold close to our heart, it's one that we actually put into practice. But I also see it a little bit differently than is suggested in the report, because I think we need to look at what are our objectives in a country. what serves our national interests, and what are the instruments that we have as a government to advance those national interests. And I think there will be many cases where the most effective, or a very effective instrument, will be an MCC compact, even if the country had an MCC compact in the past. So I think we need to look at it on a case-by-case basis and see, is it earned, is it justified, does it serve our national interests, and does it serve the other interests that go into investing to achieve development objectives. And in particular, what we get out of that instrument is a tremendous incentive effect for good policy performance and for creating favorable business climates. And when we think about these transitions, and when we think about what is going to make the foundation for strong economic partnerships, for strong political partnerships, it's going to come down to good policy performance on the part of our partner country, of the country that we are allying with. And MCC is a very effective instrument for incentivizing that kind of good policy performance that supports the kind of economic investments and economic partnerships that Peggy was talking about, and also supports political alliances. So again, congratulations on a terrific contribution to our community, and thanks.
Patrick, thank you very much, and thanks for being on the panel. Let me put one question to the group, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. One of the things we took away from our research was that oftentimes that the development community itself often recognizes the progress that's been made, and it's not the development community that's holding this up. It's some other interest. It could be in the Congress in the sense of a well-meaning interest group saying, well, we need to continue to do X or Y in a particular region. But if you take a step back and say, well, wait a minute, if they have a space exploration program, or they say we don't need foreign assistance anymore, why do we keep doing X or Y in middle-income country? You know, I could name a couple. And so on the one hand, sometimes it's a congressional issue, and then other times it's other parts of the executive branch who say, well, what we really need is we need to keep our engagement with the country, and you don't understand, this is part of our diplomatic engagement. And so it gives us a seat at the table. I heard this constantly. It gives us a seat at the table. But we try to counter that a little bit by looking at these historical precedents and say, look, in South Korea, we've got a seat at the table. We don't need to have a full-on aid mission to have a seat at the table. Or in Costa Rica, I think we have a seat at the table. We don't necessarily need to have a full-on assistance program in the same way that we used to. So perhaps each of you could talk about the issue of how do we talk to Congress about this changed world and maybe what's realistic about that? And then separately, if you could speak to specific, I'm thinking primarily about the State Department, but sometimes this comes out of some other part of the executive branch. How do we talk to them about, having a seat at the, how do we help people to see a different way or move off of sort of let's say an anchored position? I'm going to start with Rich and we'll just go down.
Well, it's a very valuable question, Dan, and I think it addresses the fundamental truth, which is that any aid program creates vested interests both here and there. That's just a fact of life. So the question is, if we want to make a transition to a different set of players, then it needs to become clear that moving to those other players will justify the political cost of breaking with the existing vested interests. And that seems fairly straightforward. It's difficult. It can be very costly in particular cases. But as you say, a seat at the table, it depends upon where the State Department and others, do they want to be at the important seat at the table, or do they want to have a seat at a table which is frankly fading away? And that has to be put to them. You used the word we. I think this is a very large community kind of driven question. It's not something that a few people can sit down and work out rationally. It needs to involve all those interests, both present and potential future, realizing that the future is where we should be, not the past.
Ronnie, are we going to get endowment authority anytime soon?
Well, yes, Dan, yes, you will. Well, I wanted to say I appreciated Patrick's remarks. He gave a very vibrant defense, which I think is warranted. On this issue of, well, both who's responsible. Rich said it. There are vested interests everywhere. I remember trying to kill the Ireland Fund for $20 million, which had lasted again and again.
I'm
and
three-quarters
again.
Irish, and we ought to get rid of it.
Well, I mean, the point was that it wasn't the Congress that was forcing it. That was an executive branch thing. I think the cultural norms of every bureaucracy are growth is good, retraction or remission is horrible. It's careers, it's programs, it's influence. So everybody looks for every justification under the sun. It's impossible to do it from the outside in terms of intelligent judgments because you don't really know what people are doing or how well they're doing it or how well. So to get into it, you really have to get into the belly of the beast. You have to spend a lot of time and it has to be disciplined. The trouble with endowments are that they are created to avoid all of that. I have a feeling if the National Science Foundation had to go through the annual appropriation process, it would look like a very different animal. I don't know whether better or worse, but I think, like Pogo said, we have met the enemy and he is us.
Peggy.
Where do you go after that? And plus, I hesitate criticizing Congress when we sit in this gorgeous room here, but I don't think it's criticism right now. I think one of the issues we see in dealing with U.S. businesses is that they often say, let us tell you where we want to be. You know, like we pick priority countries and they'll say, well, we don't want to go there. You know, we're not doing business there. We often hear on the ground floor up, where are the opportunities? Because they're the first on the ground and they don't want to spend money if it's not going to be valuable. So I think it's a dialogue. I think everything that's been said before is right on. And I think we also, if we're talking about public-private partnerships, then we really have to mean it. We have to know what people think, what businesses think, and then follow suit.
I think there are two factors. One, I think, is earmarks, and one, I think, is bureaucratic inertia. And I think that it would be a useful contribution to sort out, sort of on a country-by-country basis, you know, how those interact, or which it is, or how they interact together. I think in terms of state is a big organization. I don't think that that the resistance is from the State Department. It may be at a country level. If I'm the ambassador and I've got I've got $30 million that I can, you know, dole out, I'm not going to want to give that up. But that's not a U.S. government policy position, and I don't see state as, you know, wedded to that position. I think that the kind of discussion that you're initiating here, and the kind of consensus that I think exists within the broader community, is enough to overcome much of that inertia, and I think that we can make the right decisions.
Open it up to the public. I think we have microphones. I see a hand over here. Lee, if you could come down. So the former managing director of the World Bank and the former economy minister of El Salvador, my friend, Dr. Juan Jose de Boo.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to all the panelists. Also to Senator Lugar, with whom I had a chance to quickly speak before the meeting. I have been on both sides of the support and aid story. As Minister of Finance in El Salvador during the war and during the earthquakes, the United States and the United States people was extremely helpful, and I'm very thankful for that. And then at the World Bank, responsible for 110 countries, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America, I could see the other side of the coin. And so I understand the difficulties, the challenges. I appreciate the report and all the interventions that have taken place. I do have two questions, and they refer to my country, El Salvador. El Salvador is really a story, I believe, of success in the sense that we were able to go from hardship to investment grade in a relatively short period of time. And it is a country in transition because in the same way we went up, we seem to be going down. And so my question is the following. Today, the FMLN, the Communist Party of El Salvador, who is in power, is disobeying decisions of the Supreme Court in terms of the nomination of judges that have taken place in the last few years. How do you, especially for MCC, how do you explain to the taxpayers of the United States when a country is going in the wrong direction or in the wrong transition in order to either continue the support or not? And two, what kind of message would you give to a government like ours in El Salvador in order to get back to the right path and avoid affecting the most vulnerable people? Because at the end of the day, what we want to avoid is to punish the poor people twice for having a bad government and for not getting the aid. Thank you.
Perhaps, I suspect that's directed towards Patrick, but I may ask Rodney, let me put you on the spot as the former acting head of MCC to give a non-government answer, maybe give a chance for Patrick to think about how he wants to respond.
I will give a short response, which is we faced that with Nicaragua when I was at the MCC. We had to cut them off. It seems to me you've got to have standards and criteria. If you don't, then the whole incentive effect is lost. And you raise a question of why have a program, except to have a program. I think I'll let Patrick speak for the MCC now, but it seems to me that's a very powerful tool, and you therefore have to keep it sharp.
The MCC cares deeply about the standards of democratic governance in the countries that we work with. And our partner countries understand that. It's part of our regular ongoing dialogue with the countries. And in particular, we're concerned about the institutional environment in a country, and those institutions which are responsible for ensuring free and independent good democratic governance. So we tend we make a distinction between a specific action, which may not be a good action, but may not constitute a pattern of actions or a weakening of the institutional environment, and then the institutional environment. And if the institutional environment is being degraded in a negative way, then that is of deep concern to us, and I can assure you it would become a central part of our dialogue with the government, with any government. So this isn't specific to the El Salvador case, but it's how we approach our partnerships with countries, and the fact that we have an agreement that's based on a mutual commitment between the U.S. and the partner country to respect certain norms, one of which is democratic governance.
Got a sea of hands. This is great. The woman up front and then the gentleman back there. We'll bunch them together World Bank style. So if you could identify yourself, please.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School, and I want to do a follow-on to his. The issue I have as an American citizen is understanding what you all do. I was lucky enough a few weeks ago to be sent the Alan Alda, The Flame story. I urge you all to look at it. It's about how do you explain to 11-year-olds what a flame looks like. He set up a worldwide contest, 800 submissions, and 6,000 11-year-olds evaluated and chose the winner. I think our academics they can write for each other, but I think they need to write for 11-year-olds as well. I think it needs to be a requirement. You want the public to support you. It's the public who are sending people to Capitol Hill. If we don't educate them, we're not going to get the right people here to give you the funding you want. This is all about telling the narrative. It's very hard. It takes real skill. You'll have to hire really talented people to help you do it, but it has to be clear, concise, compelling. We live in a very complex, interdependent world. We no longer have simple answers. When I went to the Pentagon, it was all about technology was our force multiplier. Look what our technology has done. It's now available for everybody. We never thought about it this way. But I think you have to tell your stories, Because I don't know how you can run a democracy if the public doesn't understand it. So I want to know how you're going to tell your stories so the rest of us get it.
Let's get one other question. That gentleman right there. Will you identify yourself, please?
My name is Alan Herbert. I'm with Futron Corporation, and we have been focusing on African aviation in the space, and we have worked with the USTDA, who have been very, very helpful. I have a three-part question. One to you, Daniel, is why in your SCIS booklet here that Sub-Saharan Africa wasn't included. Also for USTDA, one of the big things is relationships. A lot of the smaller companies, we can't be on the ground. And what have you looked at in working with the diaspora here in the United States in terms of Asians, Indians, African Americans, and Africans to really work with them? Because some of them already have relationships in the countries there. And my last one is to Mr. Fine. In terms of MCC, have you guys looked at out-of-the-box issues? It seems to be everything's focused on, which is important, energy and some technology issues, but what about space, which is very important right now around the world? What about new types of technologies, things like that? What have you guys looked at that? Thank you very much.
Let me take one more question. Let's see, the gentleman up here, please.
Thank you so much. I'm Akbar Khwaja. I'm a well-being retiree and former senator from Pakistan. My question on table 12. First, what is your criteria on the threshold for middle income? And then how did you select this group of country for the study? Thank you.
Okay, why don't I take that one? We could have taken any number of different countries to look at, and we thought this would be, we thought India was an obvious one. What we wanted to do is look at several democratic countries, regionally diverse, sort of different situations in terms of whether they were autocratic or not, and we wanted to look at countries that didn't necessarily have some overriding geostrategic interest. So in the case of Pakistan, there's obviously an ongoing overriding geostrategic interest in staying engaged with Pakistan. We thought this would confuse, we wanted to take that out of the equation and then add it back in later. So our thinking was, let's take some countries, and we also took Panama as a small country as an outlier to give folks a sense of, okay, what does a small country look like as we're exiting? And we picked Russia because it was autocratic and had a whole bunch of other aspects to it that made it more complicated. With Brazil and India, there was sort of a clear sense of an opportunity on a number of different fronts, and they weren't as complicated a bilateral relationship. That was basically the thinking behind it. So I think that's how we came to that. And then in terms of just capturing making sure we get the questions right. I'm wondering if Rodney and Rich, you could take this issue of, let's call it making the story more, how do we cut through bureaucratic gobbledygook, and how do we talk in simple, accessible English that Andrew Natsios used to call it, I don't like California talk, and there's a lot of California talk in the development business. So if you could each speak to that, and then I'll add the gentleman's three-part question, and I'll come back and answer his part of the three.
I mean, it's a great point, and I think that frankly we drink our own Kool-Aid so much that we really believe that we're explaining something when all we're doing is obfuscating. I think, one, you need external validators, you need third parties, you need groups that are not affected by the success to talk about it. Part two is I think you need to have stories that people can relate to. For example, the story about the AIDS epidemic and the coffin makers. Okay, people in the Washington Post over the weekend. That's something that people can understand in a way that gets beyond supply chain management and sustainable cold storage and et cetera. I think a large part of it, however, is it has to come from inside. I don't think you need to hire media folks or communicators. You need the people who are practicing to use common English, and just as there was the trend in legal documents to take it away from the 12-page boiler space and boilerplate and put it down to, okay, could an 11-year-old understand that? Could your average bureaucrat understand it? More or less equivalencies. Just joking. But I think that's a challenge, and the generalizations creep in if you let them. You need somebody who is really looking to take out the passive voice, to use a specific example to find the third-party validation.
I'd actually like to reframe the question slightly, which is that basically there's no way that AID or the government collectively can explain adequately in terms of effective outreach in terms of today's media to the American public what really goes on. It has to go through millions of ambassadors. And the predominant voice there, I would say, belongs to the NGOs, the contractors, the organizations that actually have roots through all of the communities and get very large contracts and their major financial support from AID, and frankly, whose experience is frequently adversarial. And the image of the bureaucracy is that it makes life difficult for those organizations who would like to be out in the field doing their work without any government hindrance, but with the resources. So that actually is a problem that I don't think there's any way the government can overcome directly. I think the answer actually relates to the question back there about the diaspora, which is an example of what I call the new communities that will be part of the image, the vision that Dan's laid out in his study. Just to pick one example, next 2 weeks, the State Department is hosting a very large conference of diaspora scientists in this country. It's the second annual meeting of those scientists. And these are people we have found at the Academy actually form the most enthusiastic core of applicants and partnership builders when we announce, because we run a series of programs in many of the countries, including middle-income countries as well as global programs for joint research involving U.S. and foreign scientists on development issues. And they are the people who really sustain the programs, who communicate a very positive image of where things are going, are problem solvers. And so to have something like that happening, where in fact the State Department, on behalf of AID and others, shows that they recognize them as a serious force for building the next coalition, the future coalition for meeting the kind of challenges here. I think it's very interesting. You could go across all the different sectors. I think you go across the business community. You could go through many different sectors. It's well known that over half of the major startups in the Silicon Valley are done by diaspora technologists here. I mean, we can put all this together, and I think it'd be much more exciting than trying to go back to persuade the traditional community to have a really friendly, positive message.
Let me address part one of the question about why not Africa. We could have easily included South Africa in the example. I think the administration, to its great credit, has negotiated a transition of, for example, in the PEPFAR relationship with South Africa. So I think this is certainly relevant to what's going on with the administration now, and we could have easily picked South Africa. We just didn't. We just had to pick four, and we didn't include South Africa.
With regard to the, reaching out to the local community, we actually have started an initiative called Making Global Local. As I had said before, we do a lot of these reverse trade missions, and we bring people from overseas, and we've doubled that number in the last year, all across the country. Now we are making an effort when we go someplace to see if we can set up a meeting with the local business community, and often it's informal, but often we use the local business community on the ground to do the inviting, but then we do meet them and talk to small business owners to see whether we can do business together. So that initiative started about 6 or 8 months ago. We've already done a number of activities, but it will become an integral part of how we go across the country.
I'm sensitive to the time, so I think we're going to need to stop here, but I would ask you to help me in recognizing the panelists. Thank you.